Thank you, Rich, for outing me just right off the top of the whole Northern California thing. It is really good to be with all of you tonight and to hear all that God is doing in and through the ministry and mission of this church. It's just when I think about the churches in our particular tribe that are living out and not just talking about the mission, that are laser focused on Jesus and reaching new people, you guys are one of those churches. And so it's such an encouragement to me to see that God has been so faithful in and through your church, and it's really cool to worship with you. So thanks for letting me be here. Thanks for the invite, Rich. And just the fact that it was 107 when we left Dallas to be here is also kind of a bonus for being here this weekend as well. 107 degrees, that's accurate. Originally, I thought that Rich was going to be gone this weekend, and so I had all these stories, all this dirt that I was going to bring up and share with you. But change of plans, he is here and he's in the front row, so we're going to save that for another time. So let's turn together in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 32. And I think it's page 52 if you want to use that Bible that is there in front of you. We're going to read through this. I'd encourage you to keep it open as we walk through this text in Genesis 32. You've been in this series called Pardon Our Dust. And there's a lot of construction going on around here. I've seen that, and it's a real exciting time for your church. It's also a little bit stressful. But there's kind of this idea that you and I are works in progress, that there's a renovation going on of our hearts, our minds, of our character and our soul. And that's what it means to be God's workmanship. And that certainly is the case when you open up the scriptures and you look at some of the leaders, the women and the men that God has called and blessed and launched into his rescue mission in the world. Rick Warren writes about this. He says, Abraham was on Medicare. Moses had a speech impediment. Joseph was an ex-con. Rahab was a call girl. David was a homicidal adulterer. Elijah was bipolar. John the Baptist ate bugs. Thomas doubted. Gideon panicked. Martha obsessed over housekeeping and dinner plans. That's Martha in the Bible, not Martha Stewart. Jonah was racist and directionally challenged. Samson was relationally challenged. Zacchaeus was vertically challenged and integrity challenged. And he worked for the IRS, which meant nobody liked him. Jeremiah thought he was too young, and Sarah thought she was too old. Peter was impulsive, and Paul was a persecutor. Right? It's not exactly what you think of as an image of spiritual perfection, but that didn't stop God from working in and through them and sending them out. God doesn't just use us to grow his mission. Sometimes he uses his mission to grow us. And that's what we're going to look at today as we look at this story in Genesis 32. Now, as Rich mentioned, there's kind of a big sporting event that's going on right now down in Rio. And you've probably been watching the Olympics. My wife and I yesterday, we watched the trampoline event for the first time. And we didn't know that was an event in the Olympics, but it was just great to watch. And so I thought, just real quick, if you want to turn to your neighbor and see if you can guess what is the most ancient, oldest, the first event going all the way back to the first ancient Olympics. What is the first event of that first Olympics? And just see if you can guess with your neighbor. Ask him real quick. Okay. Now, there's some debate about this, and you can read about this online, but most people think that track, or some version of track, was the oldest event, running some kind of a race, going back to, I think, 776 BC, and there was actually a rule at that time that runners were not allowed to wear any clothing of any kind, because that was considered some kind of, performance-enhancing thing in that day. And now, did anybody guess wrestling, though, as the first event? Okay, we had a few guesses for wrestling. Well, it doesn't get a lot of attention. In fact, just a few years ago, they almost voted to get rid of wrestling in the Olympics. Now, when I was growing up, I went through a phase, and this may be true for you, but all I wanted to do for a season of life was to watch and talk about professional wrestling, like WWF, the whole thing. And you may remember some of the iconic wrestlers of that era. There was Hulk Hogan, of course, just the great Hulk Hogan. Then there was Andre the Great, who turned out to be a great actor as well, if you've seen Princess Bride. And then my favorite of all, this was my favorite wrestler, was Rowdy Roddy Piper. Anybody remember this guy? He was sort of the Scottish Presbyterian wrestler. And I was so into this stuff, even though it turned out to be fake. because there's just something about this battle of the will, right? Of two opponents who get into a ring, and there's this testing, not just of their outward physical prowess, but of their inward resilience. And there's nothing like that. Which brings us to the story that we're looking at of a guy named Jacob in the book of Genesis. Now, if you've grown up around the church or you've been in Sunday school, you've probably heard these stories about Jacob. And just to be really clear, Jacob is not like a model for godly character. Okay, we would never give out bracelets to say, what would Jacob do? So let's just start with his name. The name Jacob, it means deceiver, wrestler, or schemer. It turns out that was a pretty good name for Jacob, right? I mean, as we find him in this story, and if you read throughout his life, Jacob has spent his entire life manipulating and deceiving and trying to leverage circumstances to get the outcome that he was hoping for. He has been scheming his way through every circumstance and relationship to try to get to the things that he wants. He's the kind of guy that they say things about, like that Jacob, you better watch out for him, right? If you're going to do business with Jacob, you better have a lawyer. His entire life, Jacob has been grabbing, clutching, wrestling for control, because in Jacob's world, that's how you get ahead in life. He's the kind of guy that's willing to bend the truth to get what he wants. You probably know some people like this, right? There's a psychologist at the University of Southern California. His name is Gerald Jellison, and he's been studying this his whole life, and he did some research. He found out that the average person tells about 200 lies a day. And so you just think about that, right? Every little moment of deception or bending the truth or just body language that gives off some kind of deception, 200 a day. And if you're thinking right now to yourself, well, that's certainly not me. I never lie. Well, that might be number 1 out of 200 for you. My favorite story about lying, a guy's driving by and he sees a sign in front of this house. It says, "Talking dog for sale." And so he's curious about that, and he goes, knocks on the door, and the guy invites him in, and they go to the backyard, and he shows him his Labrador Retriever. And the guy's like, "No way, this is crazy." And so he asks the dog, he says, "Are you the talking dog?" "Yep," the dog replies. And the man says, "Well, then what's your story?" And this dog just starts talking, looks up and says, "You know, I figured out pretty early on that I could talk, and so I wanted to help our country. And so I went to the CIA, and they had me flying all over the world and sitting in rooms with spies and world leaders, and it was great. And I uncovered all these things because nobody figured that a dog would be eavesdropping. I was one of the most valuable spies for 8 years running." The dog keeps going, says, "But all the travel kind of tired me out, and I knew I wasn't getting any younger, and so I decided just to settle down, and I got a job at the airport, and I was just kind of listening as an undercover security officer, and I uncovered all this stuff, and I was awarded all these medals, and then finally I got married, had a mess of puppies, and now I'm just retired." Well, this guy is just amazed, right? He goes back in and he finds the owner, and he says, "That dog is amazing. How much do you want for the dog?" $20, the owner says. "$20? Are you kidding me? Why on earth are you selling that dog so cheap?" The owner says to him, "Because he's a filthy liar. He never did any of that stuff." And so, you know, whether it's like the little lies that you might tell on a resume or on an expense report or on your Tinder profile or why you're always running late, it can seem so harmless. But see, it's like this little attempt every single time to control outcomes. And what we don't realize is what a dangerous thing that can be, that over time, what we end up actually doing is we're creating this gap between our true selves and this image or false self. That every time we tell a lie or use deception, we're splitting ourselves. We're creating this growing gap between the person we really are and a false self that we think will lead to a better outcome. And it is so subtle, the ways that you and I can do that all the time, especially when it comes to relationships. So let's just say hypothetically that my wife and I, she's here tonight, let's just hypothetically that we have plans to go on a date the following night, and we're real excited about this, but then all of a sudden I get a phone call from one of my buddies, and he's inviting me to go and play poker the next night with the guys. And so let's just assume, again, hypothetically, that I were to say to my wife, "Listen, honey, you know, I'm really excited about tomorrow night, but I just got a call from my friends, the guys from the church, And they've invited me to come over for some time, for some good Christian fellowship. And there may be some accountability involved. And you remember that verse from Proverbs, as iron sharpens iron? And so I was wondering if for the sake of my character and my soul, and really if you think about it, for the good of our marriage, right, if we should reschedule that date that we had scheduled for tomorrow night. Right? Are all of those things kind of true? Well, maybe, but do you see the crafting? The turning, the subtle deceiving to try and control the outcome. And it can start really small, but over time, it has this effect of splitting your soul. And see, Jacob, he has become a master at this. He has been playing this game his whole life. A little background, Jacob had a brother named Esau. And one day, if you know the story, Jacob was deceiving his brother Esau, and he tricked him out of Esau's entire share of the inheritance. And so Jacob had to run and make a beeline for a distant country where for years he's lived. But see, now Jacob is coming home with all of his family, all of his children, and he knows that in coming home, he's going to have to confront his estranged brother Esau, whom word has it is now accompanied by a band of 400 men. And so Jacob is scared for his life, and he knows that Esau wants revenge. It's this moment of truth. And so we find Jacob all alone before this night when he will have a reckoning day with Esau. And this is Genesis chapter 32, starting with verse 22. It says, that night Jacob got up, and he took his 2 wives. Okay, problem number 1. His 2 female servants and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Verse 27, the man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. And then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. And so Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. In verse 31, the sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. It's an amazing text. There is not a wasted word. Little things like that last verse. It says the sun rose above him. Why that little detail? Well, just a few chapters earlier in Genesis 28, it said the sun had set upon him. It was as if to say, this is a new day for Jacob. This was a life-defining moment. And so here's a big question. His whole life, Jacob has heard about God. He knows the stories of God's promises that have been passed down from his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham. But has Jacob ever personally encountered God? How do we encounter God and not just know about him, not just have head knowledge, but actually get face to face with the living God in a way that you and I are never the same? And as we look at Jacob, this man whose heart for so long has been splintered by scheming and deception, there are 2 things that we need to learn from his encounter with God. And the first is this: we encounter God alone. We encounter God alone. Look at verse 24. It says, and Jacob was left alone. So on this night, there's no servants, no family, no friends, no possessions or distractions. He is stripped of all the supports, all the scaffolding of his life. And that is where Jacob meets his God. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a second, we spend all this time as a church talking about the importance of community, how we're shaped and blessed by community, and all of that is true, but somehow we hold these 2 things in tension, that even in a Christian faith that can only be sustained in community, there comes a time in every person's life where they encounter God alone, face to face. And it's kind of a challenging word, for some of us, because we are so dependent on the people in our lives, and that can be a good thing. Mentors, families, and friends, maybe your small group, people who show us God's love. And it's kind of a tough analogy, but it's really helpful, and it's from Tim Keller. He says, imagine one day that you find out that you have this life-threatening illness that's going to require major surgery. Now, leading up to this point, the people in your life, they rally around you, they support you, encourage you, they pray for you, they bring you more casseroles than you could ever eat. But then the day comes, and as you go to the hospital, your spouse may be standing at your side, but then there's that moment when it's time to operate, and you get wheeled into that room, and then it's just you. Do you know what it's like to be alone with God and to know that He's enough? He's enough. And I don't want that to be taken the wrong way, but I think there are people in churches like this, and certainly in my church, they've been around church their whole lives, but they have never met God in this personal way. It's like it can almost become this cultural thing, this cultural experience. And so the question for you and me is, have you encountered God face to face, or is it still kind of a cultural thing or a family thing? Have you met God yourself? The first thing that Jacob shows us is that at some point you have to encounter God alone. And then second, we encounter him in weakness. Once Jacob gets alone, this strange figure comes out of nowhere and wrestles with Jacob through the night for hours. If you talk to anybody who's wrestled competitively, and not the fake kind, the WWF, but the real stuff, and what they'll tell you is that wrestling is sheer agony. And yes, there are other sports that we're watching right now in the Olympics, and people train for them, and they push their bodies, and it involves pain and training your muscle groups. But is there anything else where literally every muscle in your body is being pushed to its utter limit all at once? Right, just think about that. A normal round of wrestling is what, 3 minutes? And so imagine that just for hours on end through the night. I mean, why didn't God, did you ever just imagine, why didn't God just show up and say, Jacob, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, right? We can wrestle all night and I can injure you for life, or we can just chat and I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. I'm God, you're not. But here's the thing. Sometimes God has to wrestle us and not comfort us into a transformed life. Sometimes God has to wrestle us and not just comfort us into transformation. And I think of how many times looking back in my life that I learned through suffering, through deep disappointment, and I've been looking everywhere else for what only God can provide. And the best sermon, the best book, the best worship, it cannot speak to us with the same power as the pain that we experience in the wrestling of life. Maybe you've heard that quote from C.S. Lewis. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our pain. It's in weakness that we encounter God. We're told in verse 25 that they've been wrestling through the night when finally this stranger reaches out and touches Jacob's hip so that his hip was dislocated. It's like his hip was wrenched so violently that Jacob would never walk the same again. And if you've ever had a hip injury, you know what a painful thing that can be. But it's really interesting. If you read this, the Hebrew word in that text is not this vicious kind of wrestling word like wrenched or body slammed or suplexed. The word is actually just touched. It's like this mysterious figure just reached out and like grazed Jacob's leg and he was crushed. I mean, just imagine what Jacob must have been thinking in this moment after hours of wrestling through the night to the draw, and then the man just reaches out and touches him and makes him lame for the rest of his life. You know what Jacob must have been thinking? This guy's been sandbagging me the whole time, right? And by the way, most scholars say that this is the moment when Jacob knew this is no stranger, this is God himself. My wife and I have twins that just turned 3 years old last week, and one of their favorite things to do, and maybe you've got kids like this, but what they love to do with dad more than anything else is wrestle. Especially my son Wheeler, he can wrestle for hours, and in our house we call it boom time. And he'll say, Dad, let's boom, right? And see, part of the fun is that, when we wrestle, I always let Wheeler take me. Right? I mean, he pins me down and he gets on the bed and he jumps down with like the pile driver move, the elbow into my ribs, and the way that it plays out every single time is that he always is like he's beating me and I'm about to give up and I'm like, oh, you got me, buddy. And in the end, I always let him win because he loves it. It gives him so much joy. In a sense, I make myself weak. So look back at verse 25. It says, when the man saw that he could not prevail against Jacob. Wait a minute. This is God. He couldn't take down Jacob, really? And we know, of course, the God of the universe in this moment, he had all the power, no question. But what if God made himself weak in that moment so as not to prevail over Jacob? Because if God had won and destroyed Jacob, well, then God wouldn't have got what he wanted in the first place, which was a transformed, yielded heart. And so in that moment, God becomes weak in order to win Jacob's heart. And so let me ask you, you've got the scorecard on this wrestling match. Who do you think gets the medal at the end of this wrestling match? In a sense, they both did, right? Both of them won, but only through weakness. First of all, Jacob wins through weakness. He says, God says, you have prevailed. Jacob, you have won. You finally won by admitting your faults, by admitting the reality, the truth of your weakness in front of me. And you will be blessed for now on, but you will limp. And by the way, that's just a great picture of the Christian life, that someone who leads with a limp. Martin Lloyd-Jones once asked, how do you know when you've met with God? How do you know when you've really met with God? You limp. And he goes on to say that if you've truly encountered God in all of his love and his total grace and acceptance for you, it will inflict you with this permanent joyful weakness. Isn't that great? A permanent joyful weakness. Because if you know that God loves you, no conditions, you don't have to save face anymore. You don't have to scheme and manipulate and deceive. Doesn't that sound freeing? And I know that in a place like this, there are so many stories, dozens, hundreds of stories of God showing up in our weakness. A health problem that you didn't see coming, a marriage that was on the ropes, a child who made every wrong decision they could have made. And it may have been painful, it may have left you with a limp, but it was an experience, and it was an experience that you probably would never wish on any other person. But it was in that place of brokenness and weakness that God displayed his greatness. You see, for Jacob, the weakness was literal. It was incapacitating. It was an injury so bad that he would be injured. He would limp for the rest of his life. But see, from that moment on, something else was true. Jacob was no longer wrestling. He was just a man broken before God. This manipulating cheat who had stolen and deceived his way into every blessing he had ever known, he was now broken before God. The next morning, Jacob limps away, swinging that leg, that injured leg, as he would for the rest of his life. He crosses the river. He confronts his brother Esau. He was afraid. He sees Esau and all his men in the distance. The two brothers approach each other. They throw their arms around each other, and they weep. Esau, you see, was disarmed by Jacob's weakness, his remorse, his humility, and this began somehow this lifetime of hatred beginning to heal. Blessedness, you see, came to Jacob through brokenness. And you know, Jacob's name, it would show up time and time again throughout the Bible. Near the end of the New Testament, in fact, it makes one final appearance. It's in Hebrews chapter 11. If you remember the sort of the great roll call of the heroes of faith, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Samson, and on until you get to verse 21. And it says this. It says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, he blessed both the sons of Joseph, and he worshiped. Now listen to this. He worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. You see, for the rest of his life, Jacob would lean on that crutch. He worshiped as he leaned on his staff. He found that he was far stronger leaning on his staff than he ever was on his own 2 feet. You see, his whole life, Jacob was grasping after blessing, and finally he found it in brokenness. And then one last thing you may have noticed in this story, that God changes Jacob's name. It's a funny thing. He says, no longer will you be Jacob, you'll be Israel. But then it's sort of strange. Even after that, throughout the scriptures, God continues to call himself the God of Jacob. It's one of his favorite names. He says, I am the God of Jacob. I am the God of Jacob. And I'm so grateful for that because it means he's the God of Bryan and the God of Rachel and the God of Rich. He's the God of sinners, of people who aren't there yet. He is the God of Jacob, which means there is always hope for those of us that we too, even as we're works in progress, we too can be changed because one day, God would send another son in the line of Jacob. And on the cross, he took our place. Jesus wrestled with evil so that we wouldn't have to. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. But like Jacob, he too wouldn't let go, and he held on to that curse so that we could receive the blessing. Jesus is the ultimate Jacob who took the crushing blows of judgment so that we could receive the loving blows of grace. And it is only when we see God being weak for us in Jesus that our hardened hearts are melted and made available and open for him.